want to thank Terry Shelton of La Follette School. I asked Terry to bring his sign for the La Follette School. It's supposed to be right here next to the WPRI sign. We're co-sponsoring this event, which we haven't done before because we just think it's an extremely important issue in all kinds of ways that SUs here you are familiar with and that we'll hear more about today. It was focused on Milwaukee, but I think it really has resonance for people everywhere in the state of Wisconsin. It's a factory model system, which is over 100 years old, that educators adopted, created schools that in essence monolithically process students in batches. By instituting grades and having a teacher focus on just one set of students of the same academic proficiency, the theory went, teachers could teach the same subjects in the same way and at the same pace to all children in the classroom. This created a school system that is built to standardize the way students are taught and tested. When most students would grow up to work in a factory or an industrial job of some sort, this standardization worked just fine. But now we ask increasingly more students to master higher order knowledge and skills. In 1900, only 17% of all jobs required so-called knowledge workers, whereas over 60% do so today. This arrangement falls short. So I think that's really what we're here about today. And the guy who wrote that course is Michael Horn. So I just want to say something real briefly. I can't tell you how many people called up among you in the audience there and said, oh my gosh, I read Disrupting Class, which is one of Michael's books. He's very prolific and has done a lot of other stuff that I know you're all familiar with. Michael told me to refrain from reading his whole resume, which would take up half of our time here. So I am going to refrain, but he's also, I think, the founder as well as the executive director of the Christensen Institute, which used to be the Insight Institute and is now recently located in Lexington, Massachusetts. So it's really a pleasure to have Michael here. I know a lot of you are familiar with his work. Susan Patrick, Susan and I first met last fall. We were actually out in Delafield. Susan has spent a fair amount of time in Wisconsin at a conference on school leadership, essentially. And I asked her if she'd come back, and she said that she'd be glad to. She said that she does something with Michael, and I said, oh my gosh, Michael's the one other guy too that I'd really like to have in and speak. And so they offered to come and fill us in on what we're doing right and what we're not doing so well in Wisconsin. We also are going to have a panel of local education experts who are going to come up on the stage and share some insights and take questions after Michael and Susan speak. But I'm gonna let Susan introduce them in a little bit after they speak. So I wanted to welcome Susan and Michael. It's an honor to have you guys here.
What is disruptive innovation and why is it something that we should care about? And our work at the Clayton Christensen Institute and with Clayton Christensen, the father of disruptive innovation theory, had really been about how do we help make innovation, which has seemed such an unpredictable, messy, chaotic process, how do we make it far more successful and predictable? And what we started to see in the research is that theories, good theories of cause and effect in the field, can help make these things far more predictable. And fundamentally, the process that has transformed sector after sector after sector is this process of disruptive innovation. So I want to describe it because I feel like when people hear the word disruptive innovation, it's become such a buzz term in the media that it almost loses all meaning at some point. And one of my senses is that when Disrupting Class came out, a lot of my middle school teachers looked at it and said, oh, it's Michael's autobiography. But it means something very specific. What we mean by the term is an innovation that takes a sector that is characterized by things that are complicated, expensive, deeply centralized and inaccessible, and therefore can only serve a limited few. And disruptive innovation is the force that decentralizes that world to make things far more affordable, convenient, accessible, simple, customizable, and things of that nature. And we see it consistently through sector after sector. So what I've done up here is plot a series of concentric circles. I want you to imagine that the innermost circle represents those people who have the most expertise or wealth in any given field. If you wanted to do computations or calculations, we all sort of existed on the outer circle there, And whenever a computation came up, we just whip out our slide rule on the spot and do some calculations, right? It was the advent of the mainframe computers in the 1940s that created the computing industry. Now, these machines, how many people remember mainframe computers? Appreciate the honesty. So, remember how expensive and gargantuan these machines were? They filled entire rooms, cost a couple $1 million to own, and only companies or universities would have access to these machines, and only the most trained of experts could possibly use a mainframe computer. And so the rest of us existed as what we call non-consumers on these outside circles, and we knew there was computing, but we just didn't have any access to it. And then it was the advent of a disruptive innovation, the mini computer, which wasn't particularly mini, by the way, but it was about the size of this podium here, but it was smaller than mainframes. It started to decentralize that world, or disrupt that world. And it brought forth a machine that cost only $250,000 so that more people could have access to it. Now, the real disruptive innovation was the personal computers. These things were a couple $1,000s. They were so simple that just any poor fool like myself could start to use them. Before, we had to go to the mainframe computing center to do our problems. Now the computing came to us at our fingertips. And it made the world a lot simpler and more accessible, right? Now, how many people remember those early personal computers? Expecting more hands? Okay. So those early machines, you remember how primitive they were? You could barely even do word processing on them and stuff like that. Now, this is characteristic of almost all disruptive innovations. When they get their start in these outer circles, they start as not good enough for those people in those inner circles with really complicated, demanding problems. But what's true is that disruptive innovations and technology in general improves faster than our lives change. So what at one point is just a primitive little thing on the outside, over time packs in more and more functions and features, such that it becomes good enough, and those people in those inner circles flock out to the outer circles because they're delighted with something that's more convenient, customizable, affordable, simple, and so forth. And so we see this consistently through each wave of innovation. So laptops and netbooks then were the next wave of disruptive innovation, and of course you all have smartphones in your hand or pockets that you can whip out at any point in time and tune me out if you want to become productive again. But basically, you actually now in the palm of your hand have more computing power than existed on this entire face of the earth some 50, 60 years ago when there were just mainframes. You have more computing power in the palm of your hand than sent the first man to the moon. So just think about how that process works and decentralizes it so we can all have access to computing no matter where we are. Now, we've seen it in sector after sector after sector. From cars, where Detroit got disrupted by Toyota and then the Koreans are disrupting them, to department stores, where full-service department stores have been disrupted by discount retail, companies like Kmart, Walmart, Target, and now, of course, Target is being disrupted by online retail like Amazon.com. So we see it consistently through sector after sector.
So this is just a quick interjection because a lot of the times when we're talking about these terms, we get pretty far down the presentation and say, what exactly do you mean by online learning? It gets used a lot of different ways. So fundamentally, the way that we're referring to online learning and the definition that we're set is this think of the TPAC model here. The T is the technology, and that's the infrastructure on the broadband and the technology platform or the content management system. The P is the most important part of it. That is the people. Those are teachers with professional development to change the pedagogy to be able to be effective teachers online, which requires a lot of collaboration skills, communication skills, using the new technologies. So you have the technology combined with the people and the new pedagogy with the professional development supporting it. The C is the online content and curriculum. That curriculum usually gets a redesign, being more modular, tied to standards and learning objectives. And the A is the assessment. And there are new assessment models that are in high quality online learning environments that include a much heavier focus on formative assessment, but also performance-based assessment and e-portfolios, demonstrations of work, community boards and discussion boards with students interacting with other students and commenting and remarking on their work. So the idea that there's a technology infrastructure, and the most important piece being the teacher working with new models of content and assessment with the student at the center, and then of course managing and leading these programs requires administrators, principals, counselors to help support the work, student supports, educator supports, and around all that in terms of what is possible is the policy framework and the advocacy. And I'll turn it back over to Michael.
With the help of Susan and others, we actually worked with over 100 schools and over 100 educators separate from those schools to try to come up with a definition that would capture all the range of blended learning that was going on. Because for a while there, we would show up at these conferences where different school models would present and they would say, mine's blended learning and yours isn't. And it just wasn't a terribly productive conversation. So the definition that we have now is it's a formal education program in which a student is learning at least in part through online learning, where they have some element of control over the time, the place, the path, and or the pace of learning. Secondly, it's got to be at least in part in a supervised brick and mortar location away from home. So basically we're talking about online learning in schools with teachers. Third is the modalities along which each student's learning path have to be integrated in some ways. So what I mean by that is in the old days, you could be learning your math lesson, the teacher saw that you needed a break or something, and they'd have you peel out to Oregon Trail or Reader Rabbit or something like that, really just as glorified babysitting. What we're basically saying is that the online learning and the offline learning have to somehow be connected in some integrated way. Blended learning is not simply just putting an electronic whiteboard and beaming online curriculum at students. So just as a quick point on this, we've spent a lot of money just layering technology over lectures like this, and it doesn't produce the changes that you want to see in the learning because you actually haven't attacked the learning model. And that's the big idea of this blended learning, is moving to that time, place, path, and pace of student control is absolutely critical. We're seeing a lot of emerging blended learning models in the field right now. This is a confusing chart to just sort of explain the diversity of models we're seeing out there. But basically at the top line there, I want you to see brick and mortar schools meet online learning. They have a baby who's called blended learning. And then blended learning has several offspring. And those are the models there below. So there's 4 fundamental subtypes, if you will. And then within each of those, there are variations. And we're seeing all sorts of combinations and creative ways to put these together in the field. I just thought I'd just talk through a few of them to give you a sense of what this actually looks like on the ground, to put some definitions and ways of talking out there together. And an important note is that not one of these models is better than another model. It really depends on what's actually going on within the model. Are you actually giving students the right supports from the teacher at the right time to keep having them progress in their learning? So this is one way to do it, which is the station rotation model. And in it, it's very familiar to a lot of elementary school teachers. Students rotate between different centers or stations, one of which just happens to be online. One of the things that we saw with this online learning is that when it got started really in 1989 out of the University of Phoenix, it was a pretty primitive thing, just sort of slapping up correspondence courses online. And as a result, as it grew through the first decade of its existence, it really was planting itself in those classic areas of non-consumption that we see so many disruptive innovations do, which is why I was following that pattern. And so if you look at it from actually, Susan, if you want to talk about this on the international side as well, one of the interesting things is that from an outside the US perspective, we see huge pockets of non-consumption where students literally have no access to schooling. So in emerging markets or developing countries, 70 million students worldwide have no access to primary school. 200 million have no access to secondary school. So there's huge areas where you can easily imagine how online learning would start to plan itself internationally to start to give those students options.
So I'll just jump in on a few examples of that. So think of some countries like India. India has a goal to provide universal access to K-12 education in the next 10 years. What does that mean? They would have to physically build 200,000 new schools. They can't afford to do that. So what are they doing? They're looking at training their master teachers, their best teachers, to teach online. They are internationally benchmarking content and curriculum and identifying some of the best third-party curriculum with partners in Europe and around the world. And they are going to provide access to these teachers and these courses for their students. And they have a goal to reach, to hit that mark of providing access to millions of more students. And I'll just give you one. This started back in the mid-2000s. By 2006, I was at a conference in Los Angeles with Shantanu Prakash, who was starting to do the work on digitizing the K-12 content and curriculum and internationally benchmarking it. Last summer at a Harvard conference, we were on another panel together, and I said, how is this effort to expand access to education going? And he's like, it's great. We've reached 12 million more students in 6 years. In China, I'll just give you a couple of examples. I was with the Ministry of Education back in 2004. They had already digitized the entire K-12 content and curriculum. And in China, they have a goal in the next 10 to 15 years to provide education to 100 million more people in China, especially in rural China, to give them access so that their students are globally competitive with a world-class education. And they will be the first country to educate at a high level the majority of their population using the internet. Now, this is a classic theory of disruptive innovation, where nothing is available. You move in, I don't know if you want to call it punch card or the personal computer. Remember when you typed so fast you were used to an IBM Selectric and then you waited for that personal computer to catch up with you as you were typing? But the technology around online learning is changing so much. In Singapore, 100% of their secondary schools use a blended learning environment using online learning. Their lockers have plugs in them. Every student has a tablet. They have very interactive. But their focus is on design and innovation and creativity and having students create outcomes. And the last example I'll give you is back in China. What was fascinating to me in our talks with the ministry is that they talked about how they really wanted to encourage their students to kind of challenge the assumptions and be more creative like the Western countries. And they actually are training their teachers to judge and grade students based on the quality of the arguments, to challenge textbooks, right? And that the proof and the arguments, and that the internet, quote, is helping to set their children free in teaching them how to understand digital literacy, right? And understanding what you're reading and the quality of those resources and make the argument. So there are some big shifts happening across Australia, New Zealand, all across Asia, all across Europe, and it follows Michael's work in disruptive innovation theory in a really interesting way.
So the interesting question then is, in the US context, where would those areas of non-consumption be, since most students have access to a free public school? And it turns out that you actually have to look at the course level as opposed to the school level for the most part. But if you look at the course or subject level, there's actually huge areas of non-consumption throughout the system. So we've just put up a bunch of bullet points of areas of non-consumption that we've seen traveling around the country over the last several years. And you can tell a story about each one of those and how it manifests itself in different ways. So, for example, credit recovery, huge area of non-consumption, particularly in urban school districts, where students might fail a course and have no meaningful way to make up that credit recovery. So online learning has come in and started to help those students get back on track for their learning and for graduation.
I'll go ahead and introduce our panelists. We'll start with Patricia DeClotz, the superintendent for Kettle Moraine School District. I have Jamie Laring, the executive director for Hope Christian Schools. Jamie served as the executive director of Hope since January of 2012. Nathan Carver, the founding assistant principal at Rocket Ship, Southside Community Prep in Milwaukee. And Jim Rickabaugh. I'm sure many of you know Jim. He's currently the director of the Institute at CISA 1 and former superintendent of the Whitefish Bay Schools here in Wisconsin.
Good afternoon. So I run 4 Milwaukee Parental Choice Program schools in Milwaukee here, and our goal is to really create learning environments where each of our students is getting what they truly need. We serve 99% African American population on the north side, 97% free reduced lunch. And what typically happens within our schools is we have kids that have been with us 2-3 years who have now met and achieved closed the state achievement gap. And then we have students who come into us new in 7th grade, they're at a 2nd grade level. And we have to figure out how to meet every single one of their needs and move them forward and really prepare them for high school and college and beyond. So we started looking at the blended learning model, and I'll not share all the details, but I'll tell you that whole disruptive part, we went through all of that, and we continue to go through all of that. We have tried different models and refined it. One of the main pieces for us is we're serving a population of students that needs a ton of structure. So we tried the rotational model, didn't really work well for us, and now we're really at that station-based model. I think what we're really looking forward to is as the technology continues to emerge, that we're going to be able to get better and better data as time goes on. We know that it'll be a game changer. One other little piece is I think when we first started this process, we thought it was a silver bullet, like let's just do this and everything's going to be great. And just get those kids in front of those computers doing adaptive learning. We went really quickly to define what blended learning is for us, and when we talk about multiple modalities, we talk about small group instruction, individualized learning as a part of that, and then adaptive technology. So I'll leave it there as well, but I think we've learned a ton, and we're going to continue the fight to figure out how to do it better for the sake of every child that walks through our doors.
Early on, we came to the understanding that it really wasn't about the technology. It was about the teaching. But that teaching couldn't occur without the technology. So I think one of you made that comment during your presentation. We're really learning that it's very relational. So one of the obstacles is in creating community. And when we first listened to the students that were participating in our charters, they came, spoke to my board, and their voice was loud. They loved their community as defined by that school. It gave them purpose, it gave them identity, and it wasn't about the school as much as it was about the people. And I think that's a powerful lesson for everyone. Learning is social. We had a virtual school and we couldn't get the kids out of the building. They wanted the brick and mortar. They came, even though they didn't have to, because they learned better by sharing with each other.
I'm Jim Rickabaugh, the director of the Institute at CESA 1. The question of how this started is an interesting one because it really grew out of conversations among practitioners realizing two sort of fundamental facts. One was people are working harder than they've ever worked before, at least in our experience, but not achieving the results that all of us are looking for. And that every year it seemed, while there was more money going into the system, we were finding ourselves pulling out supports. And the sort of conversation evolved into a realization that that's actually, those are two classic symptoms of systems that are in late life cycle. More and more effort, more and more resources, but still not gaining the outcomes. And so it launched actually a conversation around what does anybody know out there that we don't know that might give us some insight. Long story short, I think the conclusion we reached was this, and it's actually a painfully obvious one, and that is all learning is personal. And any system that's not organized around that concept is never going to be able to raise the learning of all kids. And so clearly student-centric, but the concept really was that the organization we have and the problem we have is we're working against a system that was never designed to do what it is we're asking it to do. That now frames this issue as a design problem, not a people problem, primarily. But we're in a system in this country where the problem is constantly being pushed out as a people problem. It is why, by the way, we keep pushing up the accountability, but we never get there. That we push on teachers to do more in a system that was never designed. So teachers are often working against a system as opposed to having a system that has a core design that has the capacity to take us where we need to go. So as an organizing principle around that, we sort of really focus on three kind of core elements. One is clarity of outcomes, the competency side of this, and certainly it includes content and other pieces, but being really clear about what it is we want kids to learn, and to define that in ways that are compelling to kids, because there's really good evidence that increasing standards has very little impact on learning. That's not the lever. Even though we spent a lot of time in this state over the past several months debating Common Core, by itself, and if you're interested, there's a study by, or a report by Tom Lovelace at the Brookings Institute that looks at large-scale raising standards, and frankly, the evidence is pretty clear. It doesn't raise learning. That's not where the leverage is. The second piece really is putting the learner at the center, this idea of really having a deep understanding of the learner. But what we learned along the way is it's not enough to have an understanding of the learner. The learner needs to have an understanding of him or herself. And unless that happens, education remains something we do to kids, not with kids. And the power in this strategy, we believe, is enlisting the learner as an active participant. Getting rid of the idea that learners are supposed to be receptacles to be filled. They're actually resources to the learner. And the idea of setting up systems where kids function all day as in compliance environments as opposed to environments that encourage commitment is powerful. And that our best and biggest work, our biggest challenge is to build learner capacity. That content can take us there, skills can take us there, but ultimately, in the words of John Hattie, every learner needs to see themselves as their own best teacher, and that our investment needs to be in the learner. That the content needs to be flexible around that. In fact, the fact of the matter is, beyond the sort of core competencies we're giving to kids, much of the content we're trying to push at kids today won't be relevant in their adult lives. Unless we develop the competency, the capacity in students, and by the way, the energy and passion for doing that, we get nothing. And so our work has been around repositioning the learner to be an active participant. That's why goal setting is so powerful. That's why asking kids how they're going to demonstrate their learning and asking kids to do that beyond the paper and pencil test is so powerful. And I'll cut this off with just this much. We've been in it long enough to see some results, and there are people in this room who can tell the story much better than I can. But I will tell you that in southeastern Wisconsin, there are kids, hundreds of kids, thousands of kids, who are achieving now in public schools and in public charters, gaining 1.5 years to 1.75 years every single year on average. And it's happening in a growing number every single year. So there are 29 school districts that are members of the Institute initiative, but we have now in the past few months, and will for the next 5 months, be spreading out into other CESAs or other regions of the state, so that by the end of this school year, there will be networks of this sort of work spread across at least half of the state. So I'll stop with that and give more detail later. But I should also say that Pat DeClott's district is part of this work. So.
Yeah, so when you look at, this is the national data from NCES, where we see online learning really coming into the mainstream are in the offering of individual courses. And so 74% of those courses are provided in high school, and 9% are in middle school, and 4% in elementary school. So where it's coming in, it definitely the course structure in high school lends itself to it. But the providers that are offering this, the highest number are actually in university and higher ed partnerships. So University of Indiana and University of Montana have online courses for high school students that cover these range of courses and advanced courses. 47% are vendors, and 33% are state virtual schools, and you have a great state virtual school here in Wisconsin that has been doing that for years. So it's interesting to see how it's starting to plan across the U.S.
In Disrupting Class, we made this crazy prediction that by 2019, 50% of all high school courses would be delivered online in some form or fashion, observing the growth that Susan just talked about. I think what happened was that when we came out with that prediction, a bunch of people thought we were just plumb crazy, that public schools could never innovate that quickly. And then within about 6-8 months, we were in Wisconsin a few months after the book came out, I think, and people started coming up to us and said, we still think you're just out of your mind, but now we think you're crazy because we think your prediction is too conservative, that the change is actually happening faster than you predict. And I think Susan and I would both sort of plead the fifth on that question and say, we think the prediction's right, going to be plus or minus a couple years on either side of it, but we also think it sort of misses the point. That the big opportunity of this growth of online learning or blended learning is not just in changing the delivery of the system, but in fundamentally putting students at the center of that system to be able to own and drive their own learning. And that's what really has excited both of us as we've been looking at this field, and us from the innovation perspective. It's what got us so excited about this transformation. So I wanted to spend just a couple minutes talking through some of online learning's benefits that we think are the big potentials of this movement to create the student-centered system. And Susan will jump in on a couple of these as well. The first one that I wanted to hone in on is personalization. So the opposite, obviously, of what we're doing right now. But our sense is that our education system today is modeled just like a factory. And you heard the quote earlier, but it was literally intentionally created that way to batch students up in classrooms, add value to them, and ship them up on the other end. The challenge with that is it creates tremendous holes in student learning, what educators call the Swiss cheese effect. And the reason for these holes is that fundamentally, all students have different learning needs at different times. So some people learn pretty quickly, other people struggle to grab onto a concept, they have to learn it more slowly. And the reason fundamentally for these differences, there's a whole host of arguments in the academic community, but what no one disagrees on is that we all have different working memory capacities. Or basically just think of it as your aptitude in the front of your brain to absorb any given information and manipulate it in your consciousness. And the second thing that we all have different levels of is what we call long-term memory or background knowledge. Literally, we all enter learning experiences with a different set of background or prior learning experiences, which impacts how we can interact or see any given learning that comes to us. So just think about it for a second to bring it home here. It's almost certain that I've used a word or phrase at some point in this talk that has been unfamiliar to one of you or evoked a certain stereotype in someone or a certain phrase. And what the human brain will naturally do is just grab onto that term it didn't understand, even as the rest of the lesson will fly by and the salient points are missed. Because we all have these different levels of background knowledge. And what that implies is that if the goal of education has become to educate every child to realize their fullest potential, which was not the goal when we first created our public education system, then if that's the goal, to see every child successful, we need a system that is fundamentally not a factory-based one, but can individualize for those different needs. And what's excited us about online learning is that it's inherently modular, and therefore you can personalize for different learning needs as a result. So this is a screenshot from the Khan Academy. How many people are familiar with Khan Academy? Okay, I'm going to make a dangerous assumption for those of you that did not raise your hand. I'm going to apologize and keep moving on. But basically, the Khan Academy is online learning software. This was used in a 5th grade classroom in Los Altos, California, and you can literally see the individual learning trajectories of each of the individual children. And if you zeroed in on that student in blue in the early days of that class, what you would see is that child actually started out the 5th grade, 3rd from the bottom in math. And in the traditional system, we would have just said, well, that student goes into the slow group. We would have given it a more PC name than that. But would have gone in that group. It would have then had profound implications for what that child would have, the math that he would have encountered in middle school, whether he would have seen algebra in middle school or high school, and whether he would have gone into remedial math in college or not. But what we realized with online learning is because you can progress through different pathways and paces and so forth, it was just actually a couple concepts that were tripping that student up. And once they were able to solve those problems, that student just started soaring. And by the end of that screenshot at day 70, that child was 3rd from the top in his given class. I will tell you by the end of this class, this full school year, there were students in that 5th grade classroom who were doing trigonometry. Literally, we've been practicing education malpractice, and that's one of the things that we think is so exciting about online learning is this ability to personalize.
My name is Nathan Carlberg, and I'm one of the founding assistant principals at Rocket Ship Southside Community Prep, Southside of Milwaukee. The first Rocket Ship school actually outside of San Jose, California, which is where the network began. And initially, obviously San Jose, Silicon Valley, computers and the learning lab, as we call it, became very much a fixture of our schools, where kids were going in and receiving highly differentiated, highly individualized instruction on these computers, a lot of times to remediate skills. I think we've kind of taken the blended learning model and added to it. And a lot of people say, oh, you're the school of the computer labs, the school of the learning labs. And we use them highly effectively, I believe, but we also try to put as much human capital in front of kids as we can and pull groups, pull different kinds of groups, different formations of groups to be meeting those needs. The technology is leveraged by teachers, it's leveraged by parents, it's leveraged by just tutors and all staff in the building to be providing data points of where these kids are at in our school. So as I said, it's something that we're still looking to change and evolve. How do we use those computers to give us the data, but not only that, but increase the amount of time and the types of groups that we can be pulling with the kids that are in our school.
The piece that I think is so important is when you go from a shift from a time-based system where that Swiss cheese learning can happen. You can have gaps, and you might get a C on an assignment or an A on an assignment, even in the lower grades as you're going through math and reading. We know that unless you fill in those holes and build mastery along the way, the students are going to continue to struggle. And by the time they hit 9th grade, they're going to have some major fundamentals they're missing. The ability to take the tools that are so useful in online learning and bring those into blended environments and have them be competency-based so you fill those gaps ensures that every student can get back on that trajectory. And what happens is all students might struggle with some concepts. So you go from being the turtle to the rabbit back and forth. But when the teacher has the tools to do the personalization and help pinpoint that one-on-one, we can keep every student on the trajectory. And you see in this model, there are students working with other students. There are these individual badges from each of those skills. They can identify the particular skills that they need help with. And it's really hard for a teacher to personalize learning when there's one textbook and one teacher in a room full of 25 kids. When you have these tools and these models, you can start getting the information so that the teachers can personalize learning, and every student knows and can be empowered to help fill in, understand where they need to fill in those gaps. But the acceleration that happens once those gaps get filled in and those kinds of results, that's what we're getting so excited about in these new models.
The word last year that I heard again and again and again, I think it was the academic word of the year or something, I got some pseudo award, was this word grit. How do we teach grit to students? I know the populations that we serve in Milwaukee, you have to have grit to be able to close that gap and to be able to self-identify where you need to go and then work with teachers, work with all these stakeholders to do that. So for me, that was a huge adjustment of, let's be really transparent with students and with families and say, this is where they are, this is where we're going to go, we're going to do it together.
So I'll get off my band bombs.
From the teacher administrator perspective, what typically happens, especially in urban centers, is kids come to us, they can't succeed, and then we blame it on the kids and parents when they can't succeed, even though the onus is on us to help them to move forward. So the mindset of educators have to change completely from, hey, I'm going to deliver this stuff to them, and hopefully they catch on to it. If not, that's on them. Completely different. When I think of the models we're talking about, every student needs to know where they're at. We have students who, we do the map testing, right? So they're like, I got a 212. None of you know what some of you educators do, but a 212, but to them, that means something because we've showed them the path to understand what 212 means, and then when they took the test in the beginning of the year, they had a 205. So we have kids now that are actually being successful because they're not just being taught at a really high level. We teach to the Common Core standards, we teach really high, rigorous instruction for all kids, but then we fill in those scaffolded gaps with our blended learning and then with the small group instruction. So I'd say my biggest pieces that I've seen is kids are happy because they don't think that there's something wrong with them. They don't think that, how come I'm not like this student? They see oh my goodness, I'm actually growing. And I can give you story upon story of kid that has come to us with all kinds of challenges. And when you simply meet them where they're at and allow them to own the understanding of where they need to be over time, they really embrace that. And blended learning is a huge part of that for us because they can see their growth. And frankly, they like playing games on the computer that help them to do flashcards and all that fun stuff too. And I'd much rather pay a computer to do that than pay a teacher, because teachers are way more important than that activity.
Been operating since 2006 under a charge to transform. My board passed a motion, actually a motion, that charged me with the responsibility to transform our educational delivery system to better and more efficiently meet the needs of all students. How about that for a dissertation title, right? But I really believe that is what we are about in the field of education. And as we looked at what does transformation mean and how do we do it, we looked first at some of the things that were maybe boundaries to that kept us from doing what we wanted to do, and embraced we embraced the idea of charter schools and instrumentality charter schools in our case. So we have 3 charter schools that are operating, 2 high school, 1 elementary. We're opening our 3rd charter school next year. But we have seen this spread in a very organic way to have impact in classrooms that are right next door to where our charter schools operate. So we see this innovation coming through multi-age, defined through a continuum of learning that's measured through competency.
I think the interesting question is, will online learning fulfill this potential? And I think there's some questions on both sides of this. I think policy is a big question mark, but I think on the positive side is that technology is improving predictably. So originally it was really hard to communicate in these online learning vehicles back in the 90s. You can remember, did anyone actually, I'm just curious, did anyone use AOL Instant Messenger back in the early 2000s? Okay, so did anyone ever try to click the video chat button? I worked at AOL, you can be honest. Did anyone? Come on. Someone? Did you have it? Yeah, it crashed your computer, didn't it? But now through Skype and Google Hangouts and so forth, we know how easy it is to communicate with anyone, anywhere in the world. So this is a screenshot of a virtual classroom. But the ubiquity with which teachers and students can communicate and work together is just going places we can't even imagine. The content is also getting a lot better. What started as flat, pretty linear sort of progressions that looked a lot like my PowerPoint, pretty dull and uninteresting, are getting more and more robust. This is a screenshot from the first ever video game-based American History online course from the Florida Virtual School called Conspiracy Code. In it, students ran 10 missions to save American history from becoming corrupted. Some of you may joke that it's too late, but for many students, this was a deeply motivating way for them to advance. And then the third thing is that this isn't really a distance learning phenomenon anymore. And I think you've heard that in our comments already, that if we'd come here 6, 7 years ago, most of you would have been picturing distance learning with the online learning. It's really a blended learning phenomenon. And so, and that same S-curve projection that we had 2019, 50% of all high school courses would be delivered online, shows that the majority of this will actually be in blended learning environments, which led us to want to define what is blended learning for the field. It's actually a perfect, I think, segue, Jim, into my next question, which is, you've just described how the system works against a lot of the progress both the problem that you identified and the progress you'd like to make. Can you each talk about the barriers that you faced in creating this personalized, student-centered system at whatever level that they occur?
Well, I'll identify just 3 and then pass it. One is just that we operate on a set of assumptions in terms of how the system operates that we take as, and without a religious reference here, but as though they were carved in stone. The fact of the matter is the system we have was created by people for an era long past. It was a fantastic design, but for another era. And so part of this is, because the system we have served us so well in the first half of the last century, it's difficult to let go of that. And most of our parents went through a system that's very traditional. And so when they think school, they think that sort of traditional legacy model as one. The second is that I think there are assumptions that there are all kinds of barriers to making change. when in fact, if we start making change, we find many of those barriers are perceptual barriers, they're not real.
So this is a school in Minnesota, and it's really interesting, just to give you an idea of how does this work for the students. They each have their own spaces. What you can't see on the outside are those individual rooms. There are groups of students and breakout sections, some of them working with teachers, some of them working on like semester-long projects and project-based learning, and other one-on-one tutoring. So there's a lot of group activity happening around the room, but you could see this creativity and innovation in their own sense of space. And I say, what does this look like today in the modern workforce? Right? Have you ever visited Google or any of these? I mean, this looks very much like what it looks like to work at Google, where you have teams coming together and being really creative and going back and tackling projects on their own. So, and then this is Summit. This is a blended school in the San Francisco Bay Area. Each student has a personalized learning plan. Every student identifies the learning goals and targets. What's interesting and what you can't see here is they took a concept from Apple stores on the Genius Bar, where they have a tutoring on site whenever any student needs it. There are teachers over at the Genius Bar. They can stop and then the next. And they have assessments are always open. Whenever a student, as soon as they hit and feel like they've developed mastery, not only is there the data and the feedback from whatever tool they're using in digital content, but they have to go and demonstrate to the teacher their mastery at a high level so they can have an exchange and conversation around it. But assessments are always open, and that's a very different concept when you have kids moving through and support. So,
concern is that we're in an era of focusing on educator effectiveness that defines educator effectiveness as instruction and what we do to kids. What we need is an educator effectiveness model that's all about nurturing learning and building learner capacity. And I think we're right on the cusp, and I think there's danger in our defining educator effectiveness as an old instructional sort of a single source provider of information in an era where we ought to be thinking about teaching as coaching, as assessing, as provocateur, as synthesizer, and not just present.
So I think at Rocketship, one of the initial hurdles that we have faced is how do we take this blended learning, this computer lab, and make it fit more cohesively into the student's day. We use a rotational model, so they're going to their ELA teacher and their math teacher, they're going to science, art, and their specials. And they're also going to the computer lab, the learning lab. Our staff in the learning lab, they pull tutoring groups, and they goal set with students, and they check in while they're working. So it kind of takes away from this idea that you're supervising me while I'm working independently on these computers. And we're constantly trying to refine that, whether it's putting computers back into the classrooms so students are rotating through, making that data more pertinent and quick for the parties that are going to be using them. That's something we're always trying to get better at. I think additionally, it was said before about data points, and too much data without the opportunity to use it is incredibly frustrating. And I think we want kids to be able to be accountable in authentic ways, project-based learning, creation, evaluation, all these sort of things that we want them to be doing. But we haven't really refined our data points to a place yet where we can assess them in those ways.
This is a first high school blended model. We went out to work with them on professional development because there is a real lack of professional development to help make this shift for both principals and leaders and teacher leaders in teaching in these environments. Now, what's amazing about Voice Academy is that prior to moving to a highly personalized blended model, they had an 8, that is single-digit 8% graduation rate at this high school. With the same students, with the same community, with this new model, every student upon entry was identified where they were, where their gaps were, and their teachers just organized all of the resources that they could. And there were kids coming into 9th grade anywhere from a 1st grade to an 8th grade reading level and math level. And within each of those levels, there are another 10 levels, right? So you're dealing with an impossible task for teachers in filling in these gaps and addressing them. But they are so dedicated to taking the data, working with the kids one-on-one. The kids have laptops. It's a blended learning model. Their first high school graduation class was over 90% and accepted to college and going to college, right? They are totally changing the community. I mean, I was at the graduation, it was so exciting, but to see how in the 4 years since they started, it has been about design and redesign. Over those 4 years, it's about continuous improvement in these models too, because as you get the information and the data back, and then some students really do start accelerating. And so when they have Saturday school, which is both for help and support, but also for additional AP courses, and they're bringing in more AP courses online because as these kids are moving through. But these are examples of public schools as well as charter schools, both models being able to embrace and having some really dramatic results. So the last one, USC Hybrid High in Los Angeles is a new school model in Los Angeles, and they're doing a mastery-based, highly personalized blended model, and they're dealing with these same issues of, in a traditional model, you just teach the 9th grade curriculum in 9th grade because that's the textbook that you have and that's what you have to do. They are meeting every child where they are when they go into 9th grade, and again, on a range mostly from a 3rd to a 5th grade level, but anywhere from a 1st grade to an 8th grade level. And the hardest thing that they had was that the teachers had no training in when students have been passed along with A's or B's or C's, and then they have these huge gaps, and they've been good students, but they're at a 4th grade level coming into 9th grade. How do you have those honest conversations? And how do you help work with students and parents not to empower them to go on and truly make them successful? And they developed this concept calling you dip your toe into the math stream. And so when you come in, the stream moves at different speeds, and every time every student dips their toe into the math stream, it's going to come back with exactly where you are. And having to embrace a school culture around growth mindset, and also about being very honest about where every student is and doing everything in your power to change what's possible and to bring these students up to high levels of proficiency and mastery and continue to move them has been, I think, we've got a long way to go in terms of culture and leadership and being able to help make this move. It's not just about the technology. It's hard to do without the technology, but it's these pieces that really matter in these environments too. Power of educators as coaches, but as learning designers and engineers to help with these different pathways become really powerful. I mean, how do you describe the change that has happened in your systems? What are some of the changes that happen for what this looks like for educators?
That for some educators it's pretty scary, but we like to talk about leaning into a situation or a challenge, and it has truly changed in Kettle Moraine the way teachers perceive themselves and their responsibilities. So it truly is becoming that coach. We call it a critical friend. Asking that Socratic question, driving the learning deeper, providing the scaffolding, making sure that the demonstration of mastery is relevant and personalized. So it's not the same, even though there's, and we call them learning targets in Kettle Moraine. At the elementary, they're put into I can statements. So you can hear kindergartners, 3rd graders talking about I can statements and making that growth and reflecting that. At certainly middle and high school, that language matures. But it also speaks to what you said, Michael, about time, place, path, and pace. Yes, and our students are truly looking at those targets or that learning progression as not something that happens during 7th hour. It's a part of their life, kind of in the way they look at themselves in the world.
That teachers see their work and their class through the eyes of learners. That is, not through the eyes of the curriculum first, not through the eyes of the lesson they have planned, but through the eyes of their learners. And when we do that, we automatically are in a place to engage kids where they are. We know that learning is an inside-out activity. Just because I teach you something means nothing unless you can make a connection, unless you're ready to learn that, you have the requisite skills to do so. So the first is this idea of shifting the sense to look at this work through the eyes of learners. And by the way, in doing so, we have so many more insights about what motivates kids, and what kids struggle with, and what kids need than if we start with the curriculum. It essentially says to students, it's 9 o'clock on Tuesday morning, you will learn X, whether ready or not.
The idea that these online learning systems, to use an analogy, well, you have GPS, you might have students starting at different places but have the same destination towards college and career readiness. And you are able actually to give different pathways, and students may need different pathways to get there. They may need waypoints where they stop and get some extra help. I think of GPS, even when you have a GPS, sometimes you need to stop and ask for directions. But you're given real-time data that what a GPS doesn't let you do is get 200 miles off course in your destination. And our current model of schooling without that kind of feedback in real time allows a lot of our kids to get 200 miles off course towards graduation. And what's the redirecting route function? When you have these blended learning systems that take advantage of the technology modalities of online and bring that in and empower teachers, this GPS system really helps every teacher know where every student is. And by the way, students can create these waypoints based on their own passion and interests and have that flexibility in time and learning environments to do it. When we talk about online and blended learning, it's all about putting students at the center, and I really don't care if it's face-to-face or blended or online. There are a range of modalities, and it's a combination of all of those modalities to serve the students when and how they need it. And so I really love the idea of the GPS modality, because you could really rethink how we consider an accountability 3.0 system. What if we said, for students that come in really far behind and we can fill in those gaps and bring them up to speed, you don't get credit for that right now, right? Even with the growth models, they're still in age-based cohorts. What if you said, per unit of time, I'll just say per semester, how much growth is happening with every single student and how much are we doing for them? And how could we think about rewarding a system that did the most, especially for the most challenged students? How could we rethink equity in that kind of environment? And it's exciting to see the tools that we have to start to do that, but a lot of the schools that are moving in this direction and absolutely doing the right thing are running two parallel universes of accountability. The one that provides all the data for the teacher in the classroom that absolutely shows you the growth, and then the other one that's the once-a-year reporting in May.